Hello viewers, welcome to K-Diagnostics, Dio here. Today we have a 2009 Toyota Corolla with a 1.8 liter. The customer complaint on this vehicle is the check engine light remains on while the engine is running. The customer also stated that the check engine light is flashing while he's driving the vehicle down the road. And when the check engine light starts to flash, the vehicle loses power. So to me that sounds like this engine is misfiring. So I told the customer not to drive the vehicle anymore. I told him to tow the vehicle to the shop. So he did that, and now here is the vehicle. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to confirm the customer's complaint. We're going to go inside the vehicle and start the engine to see if the check engine light will remain on while the engine is running. After confirming the customer's complaint, we're going to connect a scan tool to the vehicle to see what kind of trouble codes we have in the engine computer. But when you have a check engine light that's flashing while the engine is running, that's an indication of a severe misfire. And as I drove the vehicle inside the shop, I could feel the engine shaking. So this engine is misfiring. But let's confirm the customer's complaint. Let's connect the scan tool to see what kind of trouble codes we have. I'm pretty sure we're going to have misfire codes. So now let's go inside the vehicle and confirm the customer's complaint. So I'm going to start the engine so we can confirm the customer's complaint. So right there, as you can see, the engine is running and the check engine light remained on. So right there guys, customer's complaint confirmed. The check engine light is remaining on and I can feel a miss under the hood. This engine is misfiring. I don't know if you can tell by the tachometer, but this engine is misfiring. Okay, so we have confirmed the customer's complaint. So now I'm going to turn off the engine. I'm going to turn the key to the on position. I'm going to get the scan tool connected and then I'll bring you guys back up. Alright, so I got the scan tool connected to the vehicle. Right there, the scan tool has identified the car. It's definitely a Toyota. So we're going to click on Toyota. Let's just do a standalone diagnostics. So we're going to do a fault scan. This is going to scan all the modules on the vehicle. So all these other modules are fine. We only have a problem in the engine computer. So let's click on ECM. So let's get into the engine computer. So let's go to trouble codes. Alright, so right here guys, we have one trouble code in the engine computer, but this trouble code is repeated 3 times. Okay. So our trouble code is P0302, and this same trouble code is a history code, it's a current code, it's also a pending code. So this means this code was here in the past, it's here as we speak, and it's also pending. And this is a pretty self-explanatory code, cylinder number 2 misfire detected. So it means there is a misfire on cylinder number 2, and the misfire is caused by a couple of things. Okay, lack of fuel can cause a misfire on one specific cylinder. Lack of spark can cause it. Lack of compression in that specific cylinder. In this case, we're talking about cylinder number 2. So lack of compression can also cause this. Okay, so a misfire is actually a byproduct of poor combustion. Okay, if we have a combustion event that's not occurring properly, you will have a misfire on one specific cylinder or on multiple cylinders. So now that we know that cylinder number 2 is misfiring, what we have to do is we have to confirm that this cylinder is actually misfiring, because you can't always trust what the scan tool tells you. So the next step is going to be looking at live data. Hopefully we have some misfire counts here. So let's scroll down this list. Actually, I'm also going to look at my short-term and long-term fuel trim numbers. These fuel trim numbers will tell us or can give us an idea of what's causing this misfire. Usually when you have high negative numbers, it means you have an ignition problem. And when you have high positive numbers, it means you have a fuel delivery problem, like an injector partially clogged or something along those lines. So let's keep scrolling. Hopefully we have misfire count. Oh, right there. So cylinder number 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, that's all I want to look at. Let's just show the selected PIDs. So right there. So right off the bat, cylinder number 2 is got 28 counts. Okay, so now I'm gonna start the engine. We're gonna watch these counts on cylinder number 2, and then we're also gonna look at our fuel trim numbers. If we have high negative numbers over here, this will tell me that our problem is most likely on the ignition side of the cylinder. If we have high positive numbers, our problem will most likely be on the fuel delivery side. So now let's start the engine. So right there, we are in closed loop. So cylinder number 2 is definitely counting. Okay, so we have negative numbers over here. Here on the short term, our long term is stuck at 1.5%, but here on the short term we're going between -6, -7. We definitely have high negative numbers. So right there, we're going high, -9, so -10, -11. So we have high negative numbers, and our number 2 over here is definitely counting. So right there, -13, -15. So this is an indication of an ignition problem. So it means on cylinder number 2, the spark is not occurring. So the fuel that's being dumped inside this cylinder is not being burnt. So right now the computer is trying to compensate. It's trying to reduce the fuel, but instead of just reducing on this one specific cylinder, now it's going to reduce on all the cylinders, because I'm pretty sure if we were to put the O2 sensor data PIDs here, we were going to see a richer mixture. Okay, so now the computer is trying to take away fuel to compensate for this misfiring cylinder. Okay, so those high negative numbers that we saw here, that's definitely an indication of misfire caused by an ignition problem. So right now I'm gonna go on this cylinder. I'm gonna go after our ignition coil or our spark plug. I hope this is gonna be an easy one. This is usually caused by, with the numbers we have, by either a bad ignition coil or a bad spark plug. Okay, so let's stay low tech first. There's no point to bring out the big guns. This is a very small and simple engine. I'm gonna turn off the engine. Let's go under the hood and swap these ignition coils. Okay, let's start with the ignition coils first. We're gonna put the ignition coil on cylinder number 3 over here on cylinder 2, and then the ignition on cylinder 2, we're gonna put it on cylinder 3. Once we swap these coils, if the problem is the coil, instead of cylinder number 2 misfiring, our misfire is gonna change to cylinder number 3. Our misfire is gonna follow the coil. Okay, our misfire will be on cylinder number 3. After swapping the coil, if our misfire now goes to cylinder 3, we will know the problem is just the ignition coil. Okay, so let's do that. I'm gonna turn off the engine. Let's get the scan tool out of the way. Now, I know some engines, this is a 2009. Some newer vehicles actually have an injector shut-off strategy. So when the computer detects a misfire on one specific cylinder, it turns off the injector to prevent the catalytic converter from going bad. But I don't know if this vehicle has that strategy. I don't think so. This is why we saw those high negative numbers on the short term. So I'm pretty sure this injector is remaining on while this engine is misfiring. So fuel is being dumped in cylinder number 2. Since there's no spark occurring in that cylinder, fuel eventually will work its way up the exhaust stream, and which can eventually damage the catalytic converter. Okay, I don't know how long he drove this vehicle with the misfire, but I will let the customer know that there might be a potential catalytic converter problem if he drove it long enough. Even after we fix the misfire, the check engine light may come back on with a P0420. So now the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm going to do a sound test, because when you have a mechanical problem in one specific cylinder, you will have low compression, and low compression can also cause a misfire. So what I'm gonna do is, this is kind of a compression test you can do really fast. It's not really accurate, but based on the sound of the engine, you can tell whether the engine is healthy or not. So I'm going to step all the way on the gas pedal, okay, and then I'm gonna crank the engine. So by stepping all the way on the gas pedal, it's gonna put the engine in clear flood mode. When I crank it, the engine is now gonna start. Hopefully this one has a clear flood mode feature. So I'm stepping all the way on the accelerator pedal. So now let's crank it. Oh, this one doesn't have it. It just started. On those that have the clear flood mode, they wouldn't have started. Well, never mind. It's not gonna work on this one. So let's go under the hood and look at the ignition coils. We're gonna swap the ignition coils. The one on cylinder 2, we're gonna put it on cylinder 3, and then the one on cylinder 3, we're gonna put it on cylinder 2 to see if our misfire go on cylinder number 3. So let's go under the hood and do that. All right, so we're here under the hood. I'm going to remove the engine cover. So this here is cylinder number 2. So cylinder number 1 is a cylinder next to the timing chain, okay, the front of the engine. So this is cylinder 1, 2, 3, and 4. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna start by swapping these ignition coils first. Remember, like I said, a misfire can be caused by a bad ignition coil or a bad spark plug. Since we had high negative numbers on the scan tool, so our problem is most likely on the ignition side. So we're gonna swap these coils first. Let's stay low tech first for now. So we're gonna remove these 2 coils. So the ignition coil on cylinder number 3 is gonna go on cylinder 2, and then the one on cylinder 2 is gonna go on cylinder number 3. Okay. Now, since we just swapped these coils, if this coil is bad, now cylinder 3 will start misfiring, and cylinder number 2 will stop misfiring. And then if that's the case, we're gonna make sure that the wiring is good, and then we're just gonna replace our ignition coil, and this car will be fixed. Actually, instead of just replacing this one coil, I'm probably gonna have to replace the spark plugs too. But let's see if our misfire is now gonna be on cylinder number 3. So let's tighten these. Alright, so we swapped the coils. So now let's go inside the vehicle and start the engine to see if our misfire will now be on cylinder number 3. So let's go inside the vehicle and do that. Alright, so back in the vehicle, here is our scan tool. We still have our data PIDs selected here. We swapped the coils. So now, if the problem is the coil, cylinder number 3 will start misfiring. So now I'm gonna start the engine. So I can feel a miss. Watch that. Now cylinder 3 is now misfiring. Just like that, guys. This is gonna be a quick and easy one. So the problem is the ignition coil. Remember before cylinder number 2 was misfiring, but now cylinder 3 is misfiring because we got the coil from cylinder number 2, we put it on cylinder number 3, and the coil on cylinder number 3, we put it on cylinder number 2. So the problem here is the ignition coil. Now, before we 100% condemn the coil, we have to check the wiring of the coil on cylinder number 2, because if we have a broken wire going to the coil on cylinder number 2, that could be the problem too. So since this is a 4-wire ignition coil, we should have a power feed, a ground, a control coming from the computer, and then a feed. There's a feed also going back to the computer. So we have to check those 4 wires on the ignition coil. If all the wires check out okay, we will know that the problem is just the ignition coil. And then we're gonna put the coil on it, this will be fixed. So, okay, so that's good. We are definitely in the right direction, okay? So let's go back under the hood and check the wires, the coil on cylinder number 2, because now our misfire has definitely gone to the next cylinder, which is cylinder number 3, okay? So now let's check the wires, and if the wires check out okay, the problem is just the coil. So now let's go under the hood. I'm gonna turn off the engine. Let's go under the hood and check the wires at the ignition coil on cylinder number 2. Alright guys, so we are back here under the hood. I got my snap-on lab scope over here under the hood. So we're gonna use our lab scope to test the wiring of the ignition coil on cylinder number 2. So we're gonna get our ground over here on the battery. So like I said, this is a 4-wire ignition coil. So one of these wires is gonna be a power feed. I believe it's this red wire. So we will have 12 volts over here. And then the other wire, I didn't look at the wiring diagram, so I don't know which one is which. But one of these is gonna be a power feed. The other wire will be our control, probably this one or maybe this. So one is gonna be the control coming from the computer. It is usually a 5-volt square wave. So control, and then the third one is going to be a ground, and then the fourth one will be the feed. So this will be the feedback to the computer. Okay, so now I am going to set up our lab scope here. Let's go to scope multimeter. So we're just going to turn on one channel. So let's turn off the trigger. Alright, so that's good. So now we're gonna back probe. Let's start with this first wire over here, this red wire, because this is the cylinder that's misfiring, okay? So now we're just confirming that the ignition coil is good. If everything on the wiring checks out okay, our problem is just the coil, okay? Remember, when we swapped the coil, now cylinder number 3 is misfiring, okay? So we want to make sure that the coil is receiving everything it needs to work. So we're going to back probe this wire first. So that wire is back probed. So now I'm gonna go inside the vehicle and start the engine. With the engine running, we should have 12 volts there. So now let's do that. So let's go back under the hood. So right here guys, with this wire being back probed, look at what we're reading here on the screen. We have about battery voltage. So this is good. So right there we have about battery voltage there. So that's good. So we have 12 volts going to this ignition coil. So we're gonna go on to the next wire. So let's back probe this wire here. So this over here looks like the feed. Okay, this looks like the feed over here. The feed coming back the feed going back to the computer. Okay, so now let's back probe the third wire. So this over here is our control. This is the little square wave I was talking about. So it's a little 5-volt square wave. So this is our control coming from the computer to turn on the transistor that's inside the coil. So now let's back probe the last wire. I believe this is going to be the ground. So right there, guys, this is the ground. Okay, now we can compare what we saw here on this coil just to make sure that we have the same signals. Okay, so let's back probe this one. So this is the ground. So the first wire here is the ground. Same thing right there. Now the next one is going to be our control, that little 5-volt square wave right there, the control coming from the computer. And then the third wire is going to be our feedback right there. And then the first one, red one, is going to be our power feed. Okay, so we have the same thing on this ignition coil. So the wiring is good. The problem is just the coil. I'm gonna go inside the vehicle and turn off the engine. I'm gonna order the coil. Once we get the coil, we're gonna put a new coil over here. This will be fixed. Now we can also replace the spark plugs. Replacing the spark plugs is not really necessary, but while we're here, we might as well replace all the spark plugs. I will talk to the customer about that, but this vehicle definitely needs a coil for sure. So I will turn off the engine. I'm gonna order the coil, and then once the coil comes, I will bring you guys back up so we can install a new coil on this cylinder. Once we put a new coil here, this engine will stop misfiring. So I'll get the coil and then I'll bring you guys back up. Alright guys, so I did turn off the engine. I called the customer. I told the customer that his car just needs an ignition coil, but I also recommend replacing all the spark plugs. It doesn't really need plugs right now, and I don't know when was the last time he replaced the spark plugs, so I just recommended plugs also. So this is gonna get 1 ignition coil and 4 spark plugs because the customer gave us the go ahead to replace the spark plugs as well. So I did get a new ignition coil, and here is the part number. This is the part number for the ignition coil. So I'm going to disconnect this. Actually, I'm not gonna replace the spark plugs yet. I'm going to swap the coils first. So this coil over here came from cylinder number 3. So we're gonna return it on cylinder number 3 first. And then we will put our new coil over here on cylinder number 2. Remember, we swapped these coils just to check and see. So this is a pretty quick and easy one, guys. I hope you learn something from this. I know it doesn't really get that easy very often, but this is just an easy one. So now this is the bad coil, so we're gonna remove this. Okay, and this is the coil that was originally on cylinder number 3. So we're gonna put it back here. So now I'm going, so this is the bad ignition coil. We're just gonna put it right there. So now I'm gonna get the new coil out of the box. So here is the new coil. So we're gonna install it. So our problem was not the wiring, not even the spark plug. The problem was the coil. Because when we put the coil on cylinder number 2, on cylinder 3, our misfire went to cylinder number 3. Okay, so now I'm going to go inside the vehicle and start the engine. Since we replaced the ignition coil, this engine will stop misfiring. At that point, we can end this video here, but I'm also gonna replace these spark plugs. I just want to show you that the problem was really the coil. We may or may not replace the spark plugs, but I always recommend, since I don't know when was the last time the plugs had been done on this vehicle, so we're also going to replace the plugs. But before we install the plugs, let's just try this new coil with the old plug and see what happens. So now I'm going to go inside the vehicle and start the engine. Let's get this lab scope out of here. We don't need this anymore. So I'm going to go inside the vehicle and start the engine. Alright, we are back in the vehicle. We're going to bring our scan tool up here. We put a new coil on cylinder number 2. So now I'm going to start the engine. Let's see if this cylinder will keep misfiring. Right off the bat, I can tell that the engine sounds better. The engine is no longer misfiring. And as you can see, none of these cylinders are counting. So this engine sounds really good, it runs good, so this is fixed. As you can see, we don't have high negative numbers here anymore. So this is a fix, guys. 0 on all the cylinders. So that's good. So I'm going to turn off the engine. Okay. Actually, we can erase the trouble codes. Let's go to codes. I mean, at this point, I feel comfortable erasing the trouble codes. Let's go to erase codes. Okay, we no longer have a trouble code. Let's start the engine. The engine sounds good. The check engine light is off. So this is fixed. Okay, so I'm gonna leave it right over here, guys. I'm gonna replace the spark plugs. Since I recommended the spark plugs, I'm gonna replace them. But the problem was just a defective ignition coil. Okay, so I'm going to turn off the engine. Let's go under the hood and replace the spark plugs. After we get all the spark plugs replaced, then we're gonna wrap up this video. So let's go under the hood and get the spark plugs replaced. Alright, so here's the spark plug that came out of cylinder number 1. So right there, I hope you can see that. The gap is pretty wide on it. So now we're gonna install the new one. So here comes the spark plug that was on cylinder number 2. As you can see, it's a little fouled. So look at this, the spark plug that came out of cylinder 1 and the one that was on cylinder number 2. As you can see, this one over here was not firing at all. I mean, they're a little hot, but I hope you can see that. So now we're gonna put a new spark plug on cylinder number 2. Alright, so we have replaced the spark plugs, so everything is back together. I'm gonna start the engine so we can listen to it one last time before we wrap up this video. So now I'm gonna start the engine. The engine sounds a lot better. It's not misfiring anymore. The engine is no longer shaking. Here are the spark plugs that we replaced and this ignition coil. Okay, so the engine sounds a lot better. So I'm gonna go inside the vehicle and turn off the engine so we can wrap up this video. Alright guys, so this vehicle is fixed. I'm gonna leave it right over here. This engine is no longer misfiring. The problem was a defective ignition coil. So this coil was causing the check engine light to flash while the engine was running, and it was also causing the engine to lose power. Okay, so we looked at our trouble codes, we looked at live data, we confirmed that cylinder 2 was misfiring, we looked at fuel trim numbers. Based on the numbers we had, that drove my diagnosis steps, because we had high negative numbers indicating that our problem was on the ignition side of that cylinder. So we came here under the hood. We stayed low tech first. We just swapped these two coils. So we put the coil on cylinder 2 here on cylinder 3, and the one on cylinder 3 we put it on cylinder 2. And as we did that, cylinder 3 was misfiring after that. So the coil actually took the misfire with it on cylinder number 3. So which told me that the problem was most likely the coil. But you cannot just condemn the coil without checking the wiring. You have to make sure that the coil is receiving power and ground and control, and the feedback is also there going back to the computer. So we checked that with the lab scope. Everything checked out okay. We ordered a new coil. We put a new coil in it, and cylinder number 2 wasn't misfiring anymore. So at that point, that was already fixed, but I recommended spark plugs. We also replaced all the spark plugs. So now this is good to go. This is good to go back to the customer. Hopefully the catalytic converter didn't get damaged, okay? I will let the customer know about that. So if a code P0220 ever comes up, we will know that this misfire had damaged the catalytic converter. I hope it doesn't. So I'm gonna leave it right over here, guys. I hope you like this video. If you do like the video, give it a thumbs up. If you don't, give it a thumb down. But if you do, you gotta tell me why so we can make better videos in the future. If this is your first time here, subscribe to the channel. Ring the bell so you can get notified every time I upload a new video. If you have any comments, questions, criticism, leave them in the comment box. Thanks for watching, guys. See you next time.